Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from today. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant conversations about mental health. The Open Mind is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor to welcome and introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Marisa Franco, who is here with us today to talk about her recent critically acclaimed book, Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Dr. Franco is an enlightening psychologist, international speaker, and New York Times bestselling author who is known for digesting and communicating science in ways that resonate deeply enough with people to change their lives. She's a professor at the University of Maryland, writes about friendship for Psychology Today, and has been a featured connection expert for major publications like the New York Times, the Telegraph, and Vice. She speaks on belonging at corporations, government agencies, nonprofits, and universities. Dr. Franco will be joined in conversation by Dr. Elizabeth Laugeson, clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA's Semel Institute and a licensed clinical psychologist. Among her many roles, Dr. Laugeson is director of the UCLA Tarjan Center, which is a university center for excellence in developmental disabilities, and is the founder and director of the UCLA Peers Clinic, which is one of the only evidence-based social skills training programs for those seeking to make and keep friends. And aren't we all? As developer of the Peers intervention, her programs are used in over 150 countries and have been translated into over a dozen languages. Dr. Laugeson has authored 4 books on the topic of making and keeping friends, including The Science of Making Friends, which the Friends of the Semel Institute had the pleasure of launching in 2013. We are very grateful to both of our distinguished presenters for taking the time from their very busy schedules to share their knowledge and expertise about friendship with us today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A that is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat, the Q&A. We have a lot of people on this webinar today, so we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. Our program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel that can be found on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, beginning tomorrow. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about our Friends Research Scholar program, our 3rd annual Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held in April, and our newly established Teen Advisory Council. You can find details on our website, again, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. And our annual fundraising event, WOW 2023, which will be held on May 4th at the iconic Royce Hall, hosted by Lisa Kudrow and with special guest Oprah Winfrey. Watch our website for more information on this exciting event that will raise funds to support mental health education, research, and patient care at UCLA. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marisa Franco and Dr. Elizabeth Laugeson. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for those nice introductions, Vicki. I can't get over the Oprah thing. That's pretty cool, huh? Nice to see you, Marisa. Welcome to UCLA.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Liz. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's lovely to see you again, Marisa. And, I really appreciate you joining us this evening to talk about your book, Platonic. I want to begin by really just commending you on such an interesting book that I think very eloquently explains how the undervaluing of friendship in our culture, has really led to this sort of epidemic of isolation and loneliness, and also how understanding your attachment styles and using attachment theory can actually provide solutions for what we can do about this issue. So thank you for that. I'm very excited to share more with our audience about your book. Before we get started, though, I wonder if you might just share a little bit about the inspiration behind the book.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say I didn't start out as a pro friend at all. And I like to say that because I think friendship making is a skill and valuing friendship is a process. And, in my younger 20s, I really didn't value friendship. And I went through a breakup and felt like I no longer have a romantic partner. So I'm not loved and I don't have any love in my life. And I decided to start this wellness group with my friends to kind of heal from it. And every week we would meet up and practice wellness. We would cook and meditate together and, do all different types of things to improve our health. But the most healing thing was really friendship. It was being around people I love that love me every week, and feeling the force of all my friends' love from that group made me feel like maybe my assumptions aren't true, right? Maybe that romantic love isn't the only way that I could be loved. Why doesn't this form of love matter? Why have I been taught that, my worth is only dependent on whether I have a romantic partner when I have so many great connections around me? And so I felt like the personal was political, that my experience reflected a larger culture that really devalues friendship to our great harm. Because, as you know, Liz, loneliness is a subjective experience. So if you have these connections in your life, but you don't count them as connections, you'll still end up feeling lonely, just like I did. And so I felt like it was really important and really pivotal to elevate the status of friendship in our society, particularly in a society that's so lonely. It's like we have this gold under our feet that we see as concrete. And so that is what really motivated me to write Platonic. I wanted to begin to level this hierarchy that we place on love.
Yeah. Yeah, such a great inspirational story too, for really the reason behind writing the book. And I think what's very interesting to me too, is you mentioned this in the book, that, it wasn't always that we devalued or undervalued friendships. You actually mentioned in the book that before the 1800s, there wasn't even a word for loneliness, as we know it today. And you also cited a 2013 study. It was a meta-analysis that found that, friendship networks had actually been shrinking for the preceding 30 years. I think there was another study that you cited that found that like 4 times as many people reported having no friends in 2021 compared to 1990. Yeah. And so this, maybe is a little bit more of a recent sort of epidemic. So I'm kind of curious to know what you think about, why do you think it's so hard to make and keep close friends as an adult? And also, why is our society becoming so lonely?
Yeah. So we can talk about the culture change that, in the 1800s, people got married for practical reasons. It wasn't about love. It was like, we can pool resources. It's an honor reputationally. Your family kind of chose your partner for you. And there was this assumption at the time in the Western world that you can only get this deep love from people of your gender, people of your same gender, the only people that could really understand you. So people went to friends for the deep intimacy. And, their marriage could have been one of love or could have not been. And, friends would do things like cuddle and hold hands and carve their names into trees at that time. And even now we see a lot of the times women reporting more intimacy with their friends than with their spouse. I don't think we necessarily recognize it or often put it that way. But what really changed is, Sigmund Freud, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, 2 psychiatrists that changed the way people perceived sexual orientation. So it used to be stigmatized to have sex with someone of the same sex, but sexual orientation wasn't an identity until Freud said, sexual orientation is identity. It means you have a disordered, connection to your parents. And all of a sudden, it wasn't stigmatized to just have sex. It was stigmatized to cuddle. It was stigmatized to hold hands. It was stigmatized to be too affectionate, because now an identity is an entire constellation of behaviors. Any of those could suggest that you have this identity. And so, you see readings from people at that time being like, I really love my friend, but is this okay? Is this weird? And so I kind of argue in Platonic that, hey, romantic love in friendship is not weird. And what I mean by romantic love is being passionate about someone, being thrilled by someone, which doesn't necessarily accompany sexual attraction. We often assume that those two things are conflated. And that a lot of friends exhibit this thrill and this passion for each other, but feel kind of ashamed by it. And I went through my own process of writing a letter to my friend, and it said something like, I feel like we've known each other across many lives, and we've been incarnated in this one, and we're still best friends. And I put it away. I hid it in a basket, and I never gave it to her. And I study this stuff because I felt too ashamed. I was like, is this too much? And so our culture's has such a limited imagination around friendship, so that even if we do want to value it, we feel ashamed, especially men who have even fewer friends than women do. It's this phenomenon called homohysteria, which is the fear of being perceived as gay, which really impacts men's friendship. Like some men feel like, I can't tell my friend I love them. I can't even ask a friend to hang out unless we have an activity that we're doing together. Like, I can't be too vulnerable with them. I can't do any of the things that create intimacy. Otherwise, I might be stigmatized or have my sense of masculinity called into question. And so the system of homophobia creates a generalized fear of intimacy with the same sex that really harms our ability to connect more generally. And then, Liz, you probably know the second big reason that we could get into, which is technology.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the technology, that definitely is something we should talk about as well. But it's interesting that you're bringing up this topic, because it was actually something I wanted to ask you about, because, in Platonic, you wrote that homophobia really broke same-sex friendship in many ways, and that the consequences were actually, especially dire for men for the reasons that you just described. And so I'm wondering, what's the answer? How can individuals reconnect with intimacy in their same-sex friendships?
Yeah. I mean, it's culture change. It's flipping the script of friendship. I think queer communities have really pioneered this. Queer communities have started to consider chosen family. Like, family is a social construct. We could give to anybody the assumptions that we give to family. Like, we're going to commit to pick each other up at the airport or help each other with their kids, right? And, queer communities doing things like choosing a platonic life partner. Like, there's no reason that you can't do any of these things aside from the creative imagination and feeling like this isn't standard or normal. But our definitions of standard or normal are clearly not working out for us with the level of loneliness that we have. And so I think the unfortunate thing is, for a lot of us, our perception of what it means to be a friend is limited to once in a while happy hours. And we don't even know that by having that perception, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if I think that that's just what friendship should be, just these happy hours, I'm not investing as much. I'm not flying across the country to see my friend like I would a spouse. I'm not going to be as vulnerable with them. I'm not going to take them out on dates like I would a spouse, because, and not realizing that, I assume it's because friendship is just a less intimate relationship, but I'm actually acting to make that true and having that relationship because of the definition that I hold. And so I hope that we can really change our cultural understanding of what friendship can be, and start recognizing that friendship, its beauty and its liability is that it can lie on such a spectrum. Like, your friend could be your soulmate, or your friend can be an acquaintance. And so you could find within that what you really want and the intimacy that you really need out of friendship, even if it's not the standard.
Yeah. And I mean, hopefully conversations like this can help us to really kind of explore what we want or need from our friendships, and maybe flip the script, as you put it. And I think you also mentioned technology as being something that has impacted sort of how we view friendships. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. And what are your thoughts about technology, and also social media, and how has that helped or harmed friendships?
Yeah. So Bowling Elastic book on social connection by Robert Putnam. And he looks at getting more and more disengaged from our communities. And the most powerful reason that he actually finds, and his book is written, I think, in the 90s. I wish he would write a new edition, but it's the television, actually. Like, the television was the start of us starting to disconnect from each other. Before that, people spend leisure around other people. Then they started to spend leisure within their homes. Not only that, watching TV triggers a sense of lethargy. So you no longer want to do anything. You don't want to get off of the couch. It takes energy to interact with people and to engage with people. I call it the plop effect. Plop down on your couch and you'll never get off. And so that's the rise of the television is when we started to see some of the tides of connection really turning. And then it continued to get more and more extreme with social media. The complicated thing about social media's use is linked to loneliness, depends on how you use it. So there's a theory called displacement theory, which is the idea that if you use technology to displace in-person interaction, if you are sitting at home scrolling through TikTok and not reaching out to friends, you're going to be more lonely. But if you use social media to facilitate in-person interaction, you're going to be less lonely than someone who's not on it. So if you're reaching out to people, you're messaging people, hey, we need to connect on Instagram, on WhatsApp, it's becoming a facilitator of in-person interaction, you're going to be less lonely. The issue is that these apps are not designed for us to get off of them. These apps are designed for us to continue to scroll on them and stay on them, which inherently means that we're not using them to reach out to other people. So although the link between social media is complicated, and we can't say for sure that social media causes disconnection because it's a tool and it depends on how you use it, what we do see, and of course correlation does not equal causation, is that around 2012 is when loneliness really started to spike, like rapidly increase. What was happening around that time? Rise of the smartphone. And now we see like Generation Z, the generation that's grown up around social media, is in fact the loneliest and spends the least amount of time with their friends compared to other generations. And so I wish that we could have more literacy around social media, maybe have more limits around social media, have more friction around social media, because I think although we can use it for a tool to connect, for most of us, it ends up being an agent of disconnection, unfortunately.
Yeah, almost like a replacement for that connection. It's a false sense, maybe even of connection, unless, as you're saying, you're using it in an intentional way to initiate interactions and sort of as a launching pad, perhaps for other types of in-person interaction, which I think we can all relate to. During COVID, a lot of us were really isolated and not able to see our friends in person. And of course, this is when we see a huge rise in feelings of depression and anxiety, all very much, related to that kind of social isolation. So I think most of us now at this point in time can actually appreciate the importance of friendships and what that felt like to have that taken away.
Absolutely. And you know what, Liz, there's an interesting phenomenon that we saw in the research during the pandemic that, there's a study on interacting online with people that share similar identities as you, identity bubbles. And it's linked to being more lonely until the pandemic. And during the pandemic, people that engaged online with their identity bubbles were actually less lonely. And so it's this theory called electronic propinquity theory, which is the idea that being connected online, like propinquity is being near someone, and being near someone causes you to, connect with them more, seeing people regularly, interacting with them regularly. This can also happen electronically. And specifically, the theory outlines that when you have no other option, interacting electronically has a more powerful impact on the connection than when you do have another option. And so the implications of that is obviously during the pandemic, we had a different relationship with technology and its ability to connect us than when we do have the interaction in person. And also for long distance friendships, for example, some research finds that when you use technology to reach out to long distance friendships, it has more of an influence on your satisfaction in the friendship than when you no longer have that option. So I think these nuances, these caveats really get at the strategic ways we could use social media to be more connected. We also see that it's really important, for example, for people with disabilities who can't necessarily go outside, then, social media does do something really powerfully, or even people with social anxiety who have trouble interacting with people and feeling really comfortable around them. So then social media can be more facilitative. So there are, caveats to this story that I wish more people knew so that we could use it more responsibly in order to connect with one another.
Yeah, I love how you use the science to really kind of illuminate what so many of us are experiencing. And that kind of leads me to my next question, because, you cite many scientific studies linking friendship to things like physical health, mental well-being, and even longer lifespans, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So, in our own research at UCLA, we've found that just simply having, maybe one or two close friends is very much correlated with, increased self-esteem and feelings of happiness, and even lower rates of depression and anxiety. And so I'm wondering if you could give our audience, again, those who haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, maybe give a little snapshot of what the science says about why friendships matter.
Yeah. So the most mind-blowing stuff that I read is like, if you look at the research that links, for example, diet to how long you live, how much vegetables you're eating, or exercise to how long you live, how much you're running, for example. Obviously, those things contribute to how long you live, and people that have a healthy diet are exercising more, are living longer. But those two predictors pale in comparison to having a large social network, like being more connected, being not lonely. That increases your lifespan more than having a healthy diet, more than exercising. Now, my students are like, yay, I can just eat candy and hang out with my friends. And I'm like, that is not the takeaway. We should do all these things. All of these things are healthy for us. But, the takeaway here is, I think it's startling when you look at the research, how much public health attention is given to things like, for example, diet, and health, but not social connection, because like it's lethal. It's lethal to be lonely. It puts our body into an active stress state. It's like it's an experience of chronic stress, loneliness, and your body is completely inflamed. Your sleep is poor. You're engaged in these things called micro wakes, where you're basically like waking up for milliseconds to just check around and make sure that you're safe. What's happening is, historically, if you were lonely, you were in danger, right? You were separated from your tribe on the African savannah. So you had to be very weary. You had to say, is there any threats around? I'm alone here. I want to make sure that I'm safe. And now, even though we're no longer in that situation, our body's still undergoing that chronic stress state, our HPA axis, where we're weary. People that are lonely, for example, I speak of loneliness not just as a feeling, but as a state of mind, because people that are lonely are more likely to think they're being rejected when they're not. People that are lonely tend to be more hostile toward other people. People that are lonely want to connect with people, but also want to withdraw from people because they assume other people are going to reject them. People that are lonely reference themselves more in conversation. They report liking humanity less, liking their roommate less, distrusting social institutions. Like, it's clear, if you understand the research, that we can't be a healthy society if we are a disconnected society. Like, we're just not functioning well when we are disconnected, just because how important social connection is to us as social creatures.
Yeah. I mean, I think that really you're making such an important argument for why friendships are so important, and how really our society is struggling in this area. That, maybe it's because friendships are undervalued over things like romantic relationships, or whatever the reason may be, that this is contributing to potentially mental health issues. And so that's all, we've established that this is important, right? But the other thing I want to talk about is, in your book, Platonic, you explain the connection, that the connection with others fundamentally shapes who we are, right? So meaning that, our early relationships shape who we are and who we attach to, how we attach to others. And so you also point out that those early attachments affect how we connect with our friends. And so, and you even go on to talk about this, disconnection wounds that actually might be causing problems in our ability to make and keep friends. So very much focused on sort of attachment theory. And so what's really, I think, very cool in your book is that you actually have a little quiz for readers to determine their attachment style. And, broadly speaking, when you talk about attachment, there's sort of secure attachment, there's anxious attachment, and there's avoidant attachment. And, some of our audience might be familiar with these terms in the context of romantic relationships, but why are these attachment styles foundational for understanding how to have friends?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the thing is, a lot of connection is ambiguous, right? Like, you don't know if your friend's not texting you back because they're busy or because they hate you. And if you're insecurely attached, anxious, or avoidant, you tend to take things personally. You tend to think it's because people don't like you. And what happens is, when we assume that we're being rejected, we become rejecting. And we don't always realize this, but research finds that people that tend to see rejection when they're not there become cold and withdrawn towards others in response to this ambiguous rejection, which might not have been a rejection, and they're actually rejecting everybody else. So it makes it very hard for people to connect when they're basically constantly in this self-protective, self-defense mode. And there's this theory called risk regulation theory that kind of argues that a lot of the time we are either protecting ourselves or protecting our relationships. When we protect ourselves, we don't reach out, we withdraw, we act aggressively, we ghost. All of those harm our relationships. When we protect our relationships, we're generous, we're vulnerable, we put ourselves out there, we take the risks of intimacy, right? All of that leaves us more vulnerable. And so if we have the insecure attachment style, we tend to hover around protecting the self, not realizing that there's a cost, right? The cost of constantly being in the state of self-protection is your relationships. And so these, securely attached people, because they've had this history of more positive and healthy relationships, they're willing to take the risk of protecting their relationships and hovering towards protecting the relationships because they're secure enough to know if it doesn't work out, I'm going to be okay because I have a more secure sense of self. I don't have to always be in this protective state. I don't have to live my life trying to avoid rejection because I know if it comes, I will still be okay. And so we see with these securely attached people that their positive, healthy relationships in the past give them a set of beliefs and assumptions that allow them to continue to make healthy relationships in the future. Like that people aren't rejecting them, like that people like them, like that people can be trusted, like that they could bring up conflict and someone's going to respond okay, like that they could be vulnerable and be safe with other people, which facilitates them engaging in all these behaviors that create intimacy and that create connections with other people.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are people that are listening to this and panicking and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't think I have that secure attachment.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, is this my problem? And
yeah.
So in considering that, and also, thinking about this strong link between social isolation and mental health conditions, often when I think about things like social skills training or just simply, helping people learn to make and keep friends, I often think of this as another approach to treating mental health issues.
Absolutely.
So like in the Peers program at UCLA, we typically teach, these skills to young people by identifying concrete rules and steps of social behavior that have been shown to lead to friendships. Now in Platonic, you don't just present the problem, you actually talk about some solutions, right? So you talk about the 6 proven practices for making and keeping friends for adults. And so for those of you, again, who haven't yet read the book, but I'm sure you really want to now, what are the 6 proven practices? And also, how did you develop them?
Yeah. So first I'll say, Liz, because I think you made a great point about me freaking everybody out with my discussion on attachment. That attachment can change over time. And some research finds it's more likely to change than stay the same. Platonic is all about my read on how you can change your attachment style and my tips on how you can change your attachment style. So, and this comes from me, who used to be a lot more insecurely attached than I am now. I like I said, I wasn't like an amazing friend just naturally. I had to read it. I had to write a whole book. I had to read tons of research to really understand what it takes to be a good friend. So hopefully I'm living proof that that it's a learned skill, and friendship and connection is learned skill. Secure attachment is also learned. It's called earn secure. So I hope that this message can resonate more as empowering, that, because I think when you're insecurely attached and you don't know or understand it, you're like, the world, I just can't trust anybody. Everybody just sucks and you are powerless. But when you understand, okay, there's maybe some behaviors that I can change that will increase my likelihood of connection, now you have agency again. And that's what I hope to be the message of attachment, rather than you're all doomed unless you had, a great childhood. But yes, so following up on your question in terms of the 6 proven practices that contribute to connection, they are initiative, authenticity, showing affection towards other people, productive anger, vulnerability, and generosity. And I developed these principles. I really spent a long time combing through tons of research studies to try to understand themes in terms of what contributed to positive relationships, what contributed to positive sense of connection. And I also found, as I was developing those themes, these are all the things that securely attached people do. So there was definitely overlap there. And so each chapter is kind of about how you can become more secure through developing this specific practice, through becoming better at initiating, through, becoming more authentic, through showing affection to more people. But, I'm curious, Liz, because your expertise is on children and you also do these social skills trainings, like, what would you add to that? What do you think are some other important skills that people can cultivate to be able to better connect with people, and how might they cultivate them?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated the 6 practices, and I think initiative was a big one that I think people sometimes forget about, and it absolutely applies to both adults and children. And so, in peers, we talk about how friendships are based on common interests. I don't know if everyone's thought about that before, right? But think about who you're friends with, or, maybe in the past who you've been friends with. You probably have things in common with them. And those are the things that you talk about with your friends. And those are the things that you do with your friends. But how do you find those people, right?
Mhm.
Well, for, younger kids or even adolescents, it's often, joining a play group for a younger child, having their parent involve them in some activity that they enjoy. For adolescents, it might be joining extracurriculars at school or clubs, but again, based on their interests, and then initiating with those individuals in these activities. That's sort of how you find your tribe, right? Your source of friends. And I think there's, tremendous overlap there, in terms of how people develop friendships. And that's one in particular that kind of stood out to me.
Absolutely. Like, I wonder if there are any differences between the skill sets that children use. I think that the difference that I face with adults versus children is, I think the problem we have as adults is that when we were kids, it seemed to happen more organically. And maybe you would refute that and say it doesn't really happen organically still. But it happened a little, maybe more organically on the organicity spectrum, and so I think a lot of the times adults are like, well, when I was a kid, I was like in the playground or seeing my friend in class every day, and it just happened naturally. And so adults often assume that, like, I don't have to try. It should just kind of come to me and plop into my life. And that's something, as telling people to make friends as adult, I'm like, it doesn't happen organically. People are very lonely and very disconnected. If you're waiting for it to happen organically, research finds that people that make it that assumption are lonelier over time. People that assume that it takes effort are less lonely over time because they're actually making that effort. But I'd love to hear your input on that, Liz. Like, do you
Yeah,
see it happening more organically in children, or is that,
I think organically the environment is set up to be more social. There's more clubs and extracurriculars in school, and parents of younger children are sort of required, in many ways, to like get their kids in play groups and have play dates if they want their kid to be social. When I was growing up, it was very different. You would just go outside and play. And that's where your friends were. And, you could play in the playground at school as well, but they didn't have to have these organized play dates. But the society has changed. And, now parents are often sort of the agents of getting their kids' social world organized and connecting them with others. But I think it is very difficult for adults often. If you feel that way, if you're listening to this conversation, you're feeling that way, you're not alone. We've done cross-sectional research looking at feelings of, isolation and loneliness, and also mental health conditions. And what we found is that once people kind of enter adulthood, especially when they leave the educational system, if they're not in like a post-secondary ed or college setting, that they become often very socially isolated. And we see higher rates of depression and anxiety. But, fortunately, there are activities out there for adults too. There's meetup groups and things like that. We just have to try a little bit harder sometimes. If we're not finding those friends through our work or through our, our neighborhood, our community, through, our religious organizations, then we might have to kind of step outside of our comfort zone and try some different activities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I actually have another question for you about kind of a segue about those 6 proven practices. So just to remind everybody, and tell me if I have this right again, Marisa. So the 6 proven practices are initiative, right? Vulnerability, affection, generosity, authenticity. And what I loved how you described this, harmonizing with anger. I loved that description. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
So, because, a lot of times you think anger is this really negative thing, but, the truth is that, friends and partners will sometimes have disagreements. And if they're not too explosive or not too frequent, they don't have to end this relationship. And in fact, some people will even find that if you deal with that anger and that conflict in a supportive, mutually respectful way, it can actually strengthen the relationship. And so I love that you included that as one of those 6 proven practices. But for those that are finding difficulty in connecting with others, what are your best tips for people looking to make and keep friends as adults? And, how can they put some of those proven practices into action?
Okay. I will tell you about this through a story.
Okay.
And interlink the research along the way. So I went to Mexico City on a solo trip. I was like, let me see how I like traveling alone. I know that if I don't connect with anyone, I'm going to be lonely. So I'm going to have to connect with people along the way. Let's put Platonic to the test. So first thing that happens, I'm at a coffee shop. I hear someone else speaking American English. And I'm like, okay, he's a traveler. I know from the research, people that are in times of transition tend to be more lonely and thus more open to connection. Someone who just moved to the city, someone who's traveling, someone who just retired, new moms wanting to connect with new moms. And so we started to converse. I was like, oh, hey, are you from the States too? And then I asked him if he wanted to go to this meetup later where we were going to do a language exchange. So I made the ask, which is so important. You have to ask people. And I just say something like, oh, it's been so nice to chat. Would you be open to further connecting? And we could exchange contact information. And so we did, but that really required me to do something. First of all, not assuming it happened organically, because it didn't. I had to make it happen. And the second thing I tell people to do is to assume people like you, because when you assume people like you, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy called the acceptance prophecy. Just like I mentioned that assuming rejection makes you cold and withdrawn, when people are told to assume they'll be liked, they actually become kinder, warmer, and friendlier towards others and are then more likely to be liked. So it's me going to this interaction, assuming I'm not going to be a weirdo because I asked him to hang out. Like, he's going to be cool with it and he's going to enjoy it. The other thing I know about being likable is the theory of inferred attraction, which is people like people that they think like them. And so all you have to do to be likable, it's not about changing who you are. It's just to show interest in people and, express things that you like about them and things that you value in them. And so he ended up coming to that meetup group, and clearly going to a meetup group is a great place to make friends because you have this captive audience of transitioners, of people that are clearly explicitly there for connection. That's where we met someone who was from Peru, and we invited him to Lucha Libre wrestling match. I also did a intensive Spanish class. And what that did is it gave me repeated unplanned interaction. And Rebecca G. Adams, she's a sociologist. She argues for a connection to happen organically, we need repeated unplanned interaction and shared vulnerability. When you have repeated interaction with people, you capitalize on something called the mere exposure effect, which is our tendency to like people simply because we've been exposed to them. It's an unconscious tendency. There's a study that finds that when women are planted into this psychology class at the end of the semester, no one in that big lecture remembers the woman, but they like the woman that showed up to the most classes, 20% more than the woman that didn't show up for any. So it's completely unconscious. But I capitalize on the mere exposure effect by seeing my, Spanish classmate, my classmates learning Spanish too for a couple of days. And by day 3, I was like, do you all want to come to this wrestling match too? And we had a group of 8. This was in 5 days. And younger me would be like, what? How did that happen? How did you do that? And so what my advice is that don't assume it happens organically. You're going to have to ask people, assume people like you, research an interest to you that is repeated over time so you could capitalize on the mere exposure effect. When you show up to that group, you overcome something called overt avoidance, which is our tendency to disengage and stay home because we're scared. But you also have to overcome something called covert avoidance, which is our tendency to show up physically and check out mentally, right? So some people in that class, they were just would scurry away after class and they wouldn't try to ask anyone questions about themselves, or they'd be on their phone that entire time. And that's covert avoidance. And so me overcoming that looks like, hey, I'm Marisa. How are you enjoying this class? How have you liked it? Showing that interest, which showing interest in people makes them more interested in you. Basically, in sum, there's this theory called risk regulation theory, which is that people decide how much to invest in a relationship based on their risk of rejection. So the more that you can show people, I'm not going to reject you because you're initiating with them and showing interest in them and telling you, you like them and things that you value in them, not in a people pleasing way, but in an honest way, the more people are going to want to engage with you. So those are my tips. And just so I can streamline that, because I feel like I said a lot of some takeaways, don't assume it happens organically. You have to try, assume people like you, join something repeated over time. And once you do, overcome covert avoidance by actually engaging with people, introducing yourselves, asking them for their contact information to hang out together.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's still very, very true for children and adolescents as well. It's the play groups or the extracurricular activities that I was talking about that are based on that child or that young person's interest, so that's the repeated sort of exposure to these individuals that are also joining this group, but then also initiating with them. And maybe even we teach our kids, to use that activity sort of as this cover story to start a conversation, so that you don't have to just walk up and say, hi, I'm Liz, but more like, oh, so is this your first time at the group? Or, how long have you been coming here? And, the introductions can always come later. But the activity itself is sort of like the excuse for talking to someone. And that takes the pressure off of, having to initiate sometimes.
Yeah, there's this cool method. I think David Hoffield's, he created it. It's called the insight and question method. So it's basically commenting on something about your shared world and then asking a follow-up question. So I think, like, for example, like, I love your dress. Where did you get it? Right. Or, I'm so bummed we lost this soccer game. How did you enjoy the game, or something like that? Just like commenting about your shared experience and then asking a follow-up question as a way to initiate interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we talk about asking questions or making comments, giving compliments. These are all ways to sort of initiate. Again, I love your use of science and explaining these concepts. It's not just what you think people should do, but actually having some evidence to support that. And you include a great deal of supporting evidence for the 6 proven practices for making and keeping friends in Platonic. I'm sort of wondering, were there any studies that you came across that really surprised you?
Well, across the board, we find that our brain has this negativity bias where we notice the negative much more than the positive, which means that when we predict how social interactions will go, we tend to be cynical in our predictions, which limits our ability to engage. For example, research on the liking gap finds that when strangers interact, they underestimate how liked they are by the person they're interacting with. Research on vulnerability shows the beautiful mess effect, that when we're vulnerable, we underestimate how much people value that vulnerability. Research on affection, right? People think it's weird if I give people a compliment, but in fact, research finds that we overestimate how awkward it is. We underestimate how much people value that affection. When we are thinking of reconnecting with someone, there's just an article on this that also came out in the New York Times. We underestimate just how much people will value when we try to reconnect with them. We think, oh, they're too busy, they've moved on with their lives. And so in general, we need to correct for this negativity bias that limits our ability to engage, because if I think this is going to go terribly, I'm not going to act. And I think sometimes we do that by flipping the switch. Like, how would I react if someone did this to me? Even if it seems weird, if I compliment this person or say hello and introduce myself, what if someone did like, whoa, you're weird, don't introduce yourself? No, I'd probably be like, oh, I'm so flattered. Like, thank you for complimenting, to correct for that protection of self that happens and kind of skews our judgment. But I will say, the thing that I still struggle with the most when it comes to friendship and conflict, and it's not normalized to address conflict with friends. And often we decide to disconnect instead of address the conflict. We withdraw. Afraid our friends will abandon us, not knowing that by not addressing the conflict and fundamentally, we're ending the friendship anyway, in a more guaranteed way. At least if we address it, there's a chance we can heal. So study that's like having open empathic conflict is linked to intimacy in your relationships. And I'm like, oh, so I guess I shouldn't be the conflict. That's actually harming my relationships to try to get over it on my own and not bring it up. What I was doing with one of my best friends, we got into like these tiny tears these tiny papers to accumulate, which I think happens a lot in friendship. Like, we were playing Jenga and she hit me or something, or I asked her for feedback on a book chapter and I never got an email back from her. And when I funny enough, Liz, I found out that she had responded to my email. I hadn't, and by not bringing up this conflict, I was told before giving her trial, and how unfair that was. And I learned from that, Virginia Goldner, the psychoanalyst, she talks about how you can have dynamic safety or flaccid safety is like, we feel safe because we know no one ever brings up problems. But dynamics, we rupture and we repair, and we rupture and we repair. And thus we have a precedent, if any is future, that we can now talk about it. We don't and endure it or withdraw from each other. And so I think it makes our friendship so much more sustainable. It really requires of us is that we can no longer compartmentalize the ways that we do. I think a lot of the times we think romantic relationships, marriages, you have to work it out. You have to work the conflict. Michelle Obama's, there's 10 years of your marriage where you might be miserable, but with friends, it's positive vibes only. It's, cut them off if there's any issues. Like it should always, and that is not intimacy. Like that's what a big love writing. Platonic is like, intimacy is intimacy. The things that will make you succeed with your spouse is what will make you successful with your friends. Like learning how to have conflict, that you love them, being vulnerable with them, right? There's no form of, it's only confined to a romantic partner. And we can learn that because that means our skills are transferable. Like if you have to learn something to be successful in your marriage, you can transfer that into your friendships and also be very successful. So I think that's, there's a lot of times where I've started to question. I literally ask myself now, like, because there's this concept called relationship anarchy, which is like, you kind of decide how important you want your relationships to be instead of like having society tell it for you. And to me, optimally, I would like to value my closest friends just as much as a romantic partner. So, I had this friend and she was coming back from a trip and it was midnight. And I was like, should I offer to pick her up? Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, do this for a romantic partner. Like I at midnight. So if I really want to live out this value, if I really want to say that, yes, our friendships can be just as intimate as a romantic relationship, that yes, I think we should level this hierarchy of love, I have to face myself in those moments where I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to like volunteer myself. I have to keep asking myself that question. I have to keep being reflective. Like, well, would I do this for a romantic partner? Then I want to be also doing it for, the closest friendships in my life as well.
Well, I love that. Now I'm questioning everything I offer to do to help my friends and family. But it's such a good question to ask yourself, right? To kind of, if you really want that intimacy, then yes, we should be asking ourselves those questions. Really, really interesting book, Marisa. So interesting talking with you. I see Vicky's joined us, and so I'm guessing we're going to be opening it up to our Q&A from the audience.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Marisa and Liz. This was just a fascinating conversation, and you gave us so much to unpack and use in our daily lives because friendship is so important. I recall reading recently that in the UK, they appointed a minister of loneliness because there were so many lonely people, and that goes to show you, how important friendships are. And so I thank you for all these wonderful tips, for both of you for your books, which help so many people. And we do have a lot of questions several questions here about initiating. And several people have commented that they're always the initiator. Mm-hmm. And people are happy to hear from them, but what they feel awkward that they're always the one to initiate. Is that really a friendship if it's so one-sided? I wonder if you could both comment.
Liz, do you want to go first, or you want me to?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to go first.
Okay, sure.
There's something we talk about in peers. We talk about how, friendship is a choice. right? Meaning that we don't get to be friends with everybody. Not everybody gets to be friends with us. And there's also good choices and there's bad choices, or maybe not the best choices if you don't want to go with good or bad. There's also different types of friendships, right? It's not just best friends, right? There's kind of like your regular friends, or your casual friends and acquaintances. And so, behaviors like that, they send a sign, the signal, right? There's a sign with that. If we're constantly having to be the one to initiate interactions with our friends and we don't get that reciprocity, it's a sign. It doesn't mean that we're being rejected per se, but it just means that it's not really equal in terms of that initiation. And, thinking about the value of that friendship, if this is a friend that you really value, this is a friendship that you want to preserve, and you decide that, this is a good choice for me, then this is an example of conflict resolution, like bringing up that topic in a non-threatening way and making an observation. Hey, I've noticed that a lot of times when we get together, it's because I sort of initiated, and it just kind of was making me wonder about whether or not you want to spend that time with me, or just have you noticed that? I kind of opening it up and maybe finding out what that's about, and having a conversation about, not in an accusing sort of, you're not being a good friend, or you're not doing such and such and living up to your part. The you statements are bad in conflict resolution, right? It's all about the I statement. I'm noticing this, I feel this, I thought this. It makes people less defensive. So that could be a good starting place. But also just making a decision about, again, friendship is a choice. If this isn't going to change and you've brought this up and they're not responding to what you've, mentioned, what might be bothering you, you have a choice here. It doesn't mean you have to break the friendship off and not talk to them, but the friendship might evolve. It might change. So Marisa, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, Liz, I thought that was a really great response. And I would definitely say something similar. I would add that I think what I realize with my students is that they can be very passive about friendship because they assume that you don't want to hear from them. They assume that, if you're not reaching out to them, then you don't actually want to hang out with them at all. And so it's, again, this, when you assume rejection, it really hurts your relationship because it licenses you to not be a very engaged friend, because you're like, they don't care about me anyway. And I share that to say that sometimes it's not because the other person doesn't love you, it's because they don't think you love them, weirdly enough, confusingly enough. And so that's why I think it can be a good way to address it and to say, I would actually love to hear from you, to affirm, again, we regulate people's risks of rejection and they're more likely to want to invest in us. Other things I will say that I've done is set up a repeating time to meet with this friend that's on the calendar. So now no one has to initiate. Like every first Monday, we're going to go for a walk. Now I don't have to reach out to you. You don't have to reach out to me. It's just there. I don't have to be, resentful anymore. And the last thing that I'll say is that I think specifically with friendship in adulthood, it becomes less about reciprocity and more about mutuality. What does that mean? That it's not necessarily one-to-one, I'm going to reach out to you, then you're going to reach out to me. It's more about mutuality, which means I consider your life circumstances and my life circumstances, and whoever has more capacity might be in this chapter the one who is reaching out more. Whereas when I'm the one who's having a more difficult time, might be the one that's reaching out more. And it's kind of reciprocity across the lifespan of the friendship rather than in particular moments of the friendship. So, I have a friend who, she just had a newborn baby. So I'm probably going to be the one to be more flexible, knowing that her circumstance is a little bit more difficult than mine is. Or if a friend's going through a chronic health issue, or going through mental health issues, you might have to be the one to reach out more. And so I think it's also important to think about what is their experience and what is your experience? And is this a moment where you're going to be reaching out more? And is this just a chapter of the book, right? Because they have some sort of circumstance going on. Or is it the entire book that you've been the one reaching out to them and they haven't reached out to you? And that's, I think, the difference between a friend that is good to you versus, the friend that is good to you. It's like the ebb and flow. Some chapters, they're not going to be as invested as others because they have life circumstances. The friend that maybe isn't the best choice is the one that every chapter of the book, they've kind of been disengaged. And every chapter of the book, you felt like you've been the one making more effort and more investment.
Thank you both. Question here for Marisa, does your Platonic frame account for introversion, extroversion? There are a lot of comments here about, being not being comfortable being an initiator, being more of an introvert. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
I love my introverts. I am an introvert. Oprah, also an introvert. So catch her next month or May if you want more introvert energy. And here's the thing, introverts, you have a unique set of skills when it comes to connecting with people. Sometimes people want an extrovert energy, party, go out, be in big crowds energy. Sometimes they want your ability to foster intimacy and to listen and to ask deep questions, and they just want to be alone with you. And so I think sometimes we think introverts are inferior rather than introverts are different and have a unique skill set. When it comes to initiating, my friends, that is a skill set. That's a skill set that you can build. And I don't think we should conflate introversion with the ability to initiate, because then it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're like, there's just something about me, I can't initiate with people, right? Like, this is a skill set that you can learn. I encourage you to think about, if initiation is scary for you, in what format is it least scary? Is that maybe texting someone to reconnect? Is that maybe reaching out to someone to hang out over social media versus like going to a party and trying to schmooze with people, and still learning to lean on that skill? Because just because you are an introvert doesn't mean that you can't build these skills of connection. I think, like, introversion is always often conflated with things like social anxiety. Like, those are very distinct things. Introversion is just like, you get your energy from being alone. And, sometimes socializing a lot can take energy from you. But that's independent from whether you can learn to initiate with other people and learn other skills of connection. So I believe in us introverts. We can do it. Oprah's a super connector. Us too.
Question here. How do you recommend transitioning relationships from acquaintances to closer friends?
Liz, do you want to touch on this?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, most people, even their best friends, were at one point an acquaintance, or a casual friend, unless you grew up with that person. At some point, you were in that zone with them. And really, it's about the initiation that Marisa talks about, making plans. So, for example, you could be going to some meetup group, interacting with other people with similar interests, and having that proximity to people. But that's not a guarantee of a friendship. That's not enough. You have to not only interact with those individuals in that meetup group, but also outside of that meetup group if you want to establish a closer, more meaningful friendship. Same thing with kids at school. Or adults at work. You can have friends at school or at work, but if you're not hanging out with them outside of school or outside of work, you're probably not that close. Then again, there's different types of friendships. So it's really about, putting in the effort to spend time with one another outside of those organized activities, creating your own organized activities, whether it's going for a walk or a hike with a friend or going bowling or whatever it might be that you have an interest in. But that's what actually helps people to move from sort of the acquaintance, zone into whether it's a casual friendship, a regular friendship, or even best friends.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Liz has said. Definitely varying the environment in which you interact. I would also say vulnerability. Like, I realize it's a missed opportunity when friends reach out and ask how I'm doing, and I'm just like, good. Because that's an invitation for vulnerability. And when people actually tell me what's going on in their life and what they're struggling with and what they're excited about, I feel a lot closer to them. Like, even doing things like sharing your joy with someone. Like, when Platonic became a New York Times bestselling book, I called each of my friends one by one, because I learned that sharing your joy with people actually amplifies that sense of joy and creates closer connection. So, and it's also vulnerable to be like, I care about you enough to share my joy with you. It's the truth is that a lot of the things that create intimacy require us to assume that we are loved, right? That being vulnerable requires you to assume that they are going to respond in a safe way. Telling them about your joy requires you to think that they're going to care that you share their joy. And so creating intimacy is about giving people opportunities to love you. Are you like inviting them to your birthday party? Are you being vulnerable with them? Are you sharing your joys and your successes with them? Are you asking them when you need support, right? Those are all ways to give them opportunities to love you. And that if those are going to make them feel closer to you and you feel closer to them.
Thank you. Question here about people with mental health challenges, finding, making, and keeping friends. And Liz, I know you run the peers group, which teaches social skills for young people who are on the spectrum. Wonder if you could give some guidance on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so disheartening when it comes to friendships and to the opposite of sort of things like rejection is that on the positive side, right, friendships are very much linked to feelings of self-esteem and self-worth, that they're related to less, incidents of depression and anxiety, and also even things like independence. Just having a couple of close friends can increase independence, buffers the impact of stressful life events like COVID and things like that. But on the other side of this is not having friends and being either rejected or socially isolated for whatever reason. And, the research suggests that people who experience that type of peer rejection are far more likely to experience depression and anxiety. In fact, that's the number one predictor of depression and anxiety later in life. Number one predictor is peer rejection during adolescence. Right. So what that tells you is if you want to predict who's going to have these mental health issues like depression and anxiety later in life, go into a typical middle school or high school and look at the kids who are being rejected. And that will be one of the strongest predictors. We also know that peer rejection is very strongly connected with poor self-esteem, with loneliness, with substance abuse issues, and even things like juvenile delinquency, early withdrawal from school. And at its worst, suicidal ideation, thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts strongly predicted by that peer rejection. So when you talk about mental health and friendships, I see the two as very much intertwined. And whenever we're helping young people learn to make and keep friends, I see this as, I mentioned it earlier, I see it as another approach to mental health challenges. I'll tell one quick anecdote. I had a kid in my groups years ago who was 13. He was really a depressed and anxious kid. He'd been in and out of inpatient units, for years, this poor kid, 13. And he'd been on pretty much every psychotropic drug that you can think of trying to treat this. And nothing was really working. And he came to peers and he had some success in our program and he was developing friendships. And he came up to me at our graduation and he said something I will never forget. He said for him, friendship was the best medicine. And I just thought that was so beautiful and so true, for so many of us.
That really is beautiful. And that is a beautiful note to end this fascinating conversation on friendship. What a beautiful thing to say, and so true. Friendship is the best medicine. Again, I want to thank you both. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There's so many good questions here, but we are out of time. Thank you both so much. I want to share, just in closing, a quote that I recently heard from Dan Siegel, who is a UCLA professor and the founder of the Mindsight Institute. He made this comment about connections and friendships in a film that we just screened, Anxious Nation. And he said, belonging for the mind is like breathing for the body. And I was so struck by that. And I wonder in closing if you could just comment on that.
I really love that.
I thought it was just, I wrote it down as the film was playing. I thought it was so poignant and so meaningful and so true.
Yeah, I will leave you with one more final quote. My niece read my book and this was her takeaway: for friendship to happen, someone has to be brave. So be brave.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Liz. We will all be brave and keep all of these excellent suggestions in mind as we navigate our worlds. Thank you to everybody who tuned in today. Thank you for the privilege of your time, and we hope to see you at future Open Minds. Our next one is on February 9th with Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, and I'll have to, little bit of bragging rights here. She was our very first Friends of Semel Scholar in 2006. And she's written a book, The Grieving Brain. So I hope you'll all tune in for that. And with that, from all of us at the Friends of the Semel Institute and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, we wish you a peaceful evening. Good night, stay safe, and be well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.